The leader lost. Akhananda at this time was always chasing, always in pursuit of the absent leader Vivekananda. Every now and then he would hear of him in some town and was arrived there only in time to hear that he was gone, leaving no trace. Once the Swami Trigutanita found himself in trouble in Gujarati state when someone said that a Bengali sadhu was staying with the Prime Minister, and if he appealed to him, would surely give him aid. He made his appeal and found that the unknown sadhu was Swami Vivekananda himself. But he, after rendering the assistance that was needed, sent his brother onwards and himself proceeded alone. The great words of Buddha constantly quoted by him: even as the lion, not trembling at noises, even as the wind, not caught in a net, even as the lotus leaf, untouched by the water, so do thou wander alone, like the rhinoceros. This was the guiding principle of his life at this time. It had been at Almora, as we now know, that the news reached him of the death in pitiable extremity of the favorite sister of his childhood, and he had fled into the wilder mountains, leaving no clue. To one who years after saw deep into his personal experience, it seemed that this death had inflicted on the Swami's heart a wound whose quivering pain had never for one moment ceased. And we may perhaps venture to trace some part at least of his burning desire for the education and development of Indian women to this deep sorrow. At this time he passed some months in a cave overhanging a mountain village. Only twice have I known him to allude to this experience. Once he said, "Nothing in my whole life ever so filled me with the sense of work to be done. It was as if I were thrown out from that life in caves to wander to and fro in the plains below." And again he said to someone, "It is not the form of his life that makes a sadhu, for it is possible to sit in a cave and have one's whole mind filled with the question of how many pieces of bread will be brought to one for supper." It was perhaps at the end of this period and in the expression of that propulsive energy of which he spoke that he made a vow to worship the Mother at Cape Comorin. In carrying this out he was lavish of time, yet it must have taken him only about 2 years to accomplish the vow. In the course of his wanderings towards this end he seems to have touched upon and studied every phase of Indian life. The stories of this period are never ending. The list of friends he made is never full. He received the initiation of the Sikhs, studied the Mimamsa philosophy with Maratha Pundits, and the Jain scriptures with the Jains, was accepted as the Guru by the Rajput princes, lived for weeks with a family of sweepers in central India, was able to observe at first hand such obscure questions as the caste customs of Malabar, saw many of the historic sights and natural beauties of his motherland, and finally reached Cape Comorin, too poor to pay for a seat in a ferry boat to the shrine of Kanyakumari, and swam across the strait to the island in spite of sharks to offer the worship he had vowed. It was on his return northwards through Madras that he formed the strong group of disciples who became the means of sending him to America, for which country he sailed finally from Bombay in the beginning of June 1893. Even this, however, he was not eager to do. His disciples in Madras still tell how the first 500 rupees collected for the object were immediately spent by him in worship and charity, as if he would force on his own destiny, as it were, the task of driving him forth. Even when he reached Bombay, he was still waiting for the feeling of certainty. Struggling to refuse the undertaking, he felt as if the form of his own master appeared to him constantly and urged him to go. At last he wrote secretly to Sarada Devi, the widow and spiritual wife of Sri Ramakrishna, begging her, if she could, to advise and bless him, and charging her to tell no one of this new departure till she could hear from him again. It was only after receiving in answer to this letter her warm encouragement and the assurance of her prayers that he actually left India for the West. Now at last there was no escaping the fate. That quest of forgottenness that had first borne him out of the doors of the monastery had led him also to change his name in each Indian village that he reached. And in later years, someone heard from him now how, after his first great speech at Chicago, the mingling of the bitterness of this defeat with the cup of his triumphant achievement racked his consciousness all night long. He stood now in the glare of publicity. The unknown beggar could remain unknown no more. In these wanderings through India, I find the third and final element in my master's realization of that great body of truth, which was to find in him at once its witness and demonstration. There can be no doubt that the formative influences in his life were threefold. First, his education in English and Sanskrit literature. Second, the great personality of his guru, illustrating and authenticating that life which formed the theme of all the sacred writings. And thirdly, as I would maintain, his personal knowledge and direct experience of India and the Indian people as an immense religious organism of which his master himself and all his greatness had been only, as it were, the personification and utterance. And these three sources can be distinctly traced to his various utterances. When he preaches Vedanta and upholds before the world the philosophy of his people, he is, for the most part, drawing upon the Sanskrit books of past ages, though it is true, with a clearness and certainty of touch that could only be the result of having seen them summed up in a single wonderful life. When he talks of bhakti as of a devotion beginning, continuing, and ending in love, or when he analyzes karma yoga and says, the secret of work, we see before us the very personality of the master himself. We realize that the disciple is but struggling to tell of that glorified atmosphere in which he himself has dwelt at the feet of another. But when we read his speech before the Chicago Conference, or his equally remarkable reply to the Madras Address, or the lectures in which at Lahore in 1897 he portrayed the lineaments of a generalized and essential Hinduism, we find ourselves in the presence of something gathered by his own labors, out of his own direct experience. The power behind all these utterances lay in those Indian wanderings of which the tale can probably never be completely told. It was of the first-hand knowledge then, and not of vague sentiment or willful blindness, that his reverence for his own people and their land was born. It was a robust and cumulative induction, moreover, be it said, ever hungry for new facts and dauntless in the face of hostile criticism. The common basis of Hinduism had been the study of his whole life, he once said. And more than this, it was the same thorough and first-hand knowledge that made the older and simpler elements in Hindu civilization loom so large in all his conceptions of his race and country. Possessed of a modern education that ranked with the most advanced in his own country, he yet could not, like some moderns, ignore the sannyasin or the peasant, the idolater or the caste-ridden, as elements in the great whole called India. And this determined inclusiveness was due to that life in which he had for years together been united with them. His love of the people. It must be remembered, however, that we have not entirely analyzed a great career when we have traced to their origin in the personal experience those ideas which form its dominant notes. There is still the original impulse, the endowment of perennial energy that makes the world's spectacle so much more full of meaning to one soul than to another, that must be accounted for. And I have gathered that from his very cradle, Vivekananda had a secret instinct that told him he was born to help his country. He was proud afterwards to remember that amidst the temporal vicissitudes of his early days in America, when sometimes he did not know where to turn for the next meal, his letters to his disciples in India showed that this innate faith of his had never wavered. Such an indomitable hope resides assuredly in all souls who are born to carry out any special mission. It is a deep, unspoken consciousness of greatness, of which life itself is to be the sole expression. To Hindu insight, there is a difference, as of the poles, between such consciousness of greatness and vanity. And this is seen, as I think, in the Swami himself at the moment of his first meeting with Sri Ramakrishna, when he was decidedly repelled rather than attracted by what he regarded as the old man's exaggerated estimate of his powers of himself. He had come, a lad of 15, as a member of a party visiting Dakshineswar, and someone, probably knowing the unusual quality of his voice and his knowledge of music, suggested that he should sing. He responded with a song of Ram Mohan Roy's, ending with the words, "And for the support, keep the treasure in secret purity." The Master's recognition. This seems to have acted like a signal. My boy, cried Ramakrishna, I have been looking for you these 3 years, and you have come at last. From that day, Ramakrishna may be said to have devoted himself to welding the lads about him into a brotherhood, whose devotion to Naren, as the Swami was then called, would be unswerving. He was never tired of foretelling his great fame, or of pointing out the superiority of his genius. If most men had 2 or 3 or even 10 or 12 gifts, he said, he could only say of Naren that his numbered in the thousands. He was, in fact, the 1,000-petaled lotus. Even amongst the great, while he would allow that with one might be found some 2 of those gifts, which are the marks of Shiva, Naren had at least 18 of such. He was sensitive to the point of physical pain himself in his discrimination of hypocrisy, and on one occasion refused to accept a man whose piety of life was regarded by those about him as unimpugnable. The man, he said, with all his decorum, was a whited sepulchre. In spite of constant purification, his presence was contamination. While Naren, on the other hand, if he were to eat beef in an English hotel, would nevertheless be holy, so holy that his very touch would convey holiness to others. By such sayings, the Master sought constantly to build up an enduring relation based firmly on essentials between those who were to be his supporters and this disciple who was to lead. It was his habit, when a new disciple came to him, to examine him mentally and physically in all possible ways. For the human body was to his trained eye as significant in all its parts as any model of a machine to a skilled scientific observer. These examinations, moreover, would include the throwing of the newcomer into a sleep in which he had access to the subconscious mind. The privileged, as I have been told, were permitted to this condition to relate their own story, while from the less honored it was evoked by means of questions. It was after such an examination of Naren that the Master Sri Ramakrishna told all about him, that when the day should come for this boy to realize who and what he was, he would refuse for a moment longer to endure the bondage of bodily existence, going out from life with its limitations. And by this was always understood by the disciples the remembering by the lad of what he had already attained even in this world, in lives anterior to his present consciousness. No menial service to himself was permitted by Sri Ramakrishna from this particular follower. Fanning the preparations of tobacco and the 1,001 little attentions commonly rendered to the Guru, all these had to be offered to the Master by others. The roaring fire. Amongst the many quaint-seeming customs of the East, none is more deep-rooted than the prejudice against eating food cooked by one who is not respected. And on this point, the Swami's master, Ramakrishna, was as sensitive as a woman. But what he would not eat himself, he would give freely to his favorite disciple. For Naren, he said, was the roaring fire, burning up all impurity. The core of divinity again in this boy's nature was masculine in its quality, as compared to his own merely feminine one. Thus, by an attitude of admiration not unmixed with actual reverence, he created a belief in the destiny of this particular lad, which when he himself had passed away was to stand him in good stead, in furnishing authenticity and support to his work. For the Swami was nothing if not a breaker of bondage, and it was essential that there should be those about him who understood the polar difference between these breaches of custom and those of the idly self-indulgent. Nothing in the early days of my life in India struck me so forcibly or so repeatedly as the steadiness with which the other members of the order fulfilled this part of the mission laid upon them. Men whose own lives were cast in the strictest mold of Hindu orthodoxy, or even of the asceticism, were willing to eat with the Europeans with whom their leader had accepted. Was the Swami seen dining in Madras with an Englishman and his wife? Was it said that while in the West he had touched beef or wine? Not a quiver was seen on the faces of his brethren. It was not for them to question, not for them to explain, not even for them to ask for final justification and excuse. Whatever Vivekananda did, wherever he might lead, it was their place to be found unflinching at his side. And surely none can pass this spectacle in review without it being borne upon him that meaningless as would have been the order of Ramakrishna without Vivekananda, even so futile would have been the life and labors of Vivekananda without behind him his brothers of the order of Ramakrishna. It was said to me lately by one of the older generation that Ramakrishna had lived for the making of Vivekananda. Is it indeed so, or is it not rather impossible to distinguish with such fixity between one part and the other in a single mighty utterance of the divine mother heart? Often it appears to me in studying all their lives that there has been with us a soul named Ramakrishna Vivekananda, and that in the penumbra of his being appear many forms, some of which are with us still, and none of whom it could be said with entire truth that here ends in relation to him the sphere of those others, or that there begins his own.